you're interested in the things I've talked about but you want to know more, just come up and I'll hand you whatever's directly relevant to what you want to know more about. So what I'm going to talk about is what is animal ethics. I'm going to talk about Peter Singer and Tom Reagan's arguments for the full moral status of animals. How harmful are animal products? So a lot of people have tried to quantify that, but I'm going to try and do that in a new way that has some interesting results. And finally, I'm going to talk about ethical veganism. So what is animal ethics? So the first big area in animal ethics is trying to figure out the mental life of animals. So do they have a very rich mental life where there's a lot of complex things going on? They have a lot of interests and relationships and stuff like that? Or do they have a very simple mental life where the only thing really going on is like pleasure and pain and hunger and stuff like that? If they have a very rich mental life, then they can be harmed in many more ways. And then that means there's more limitations on what we can ethically do to them. So the other big topic in animal ethics is moral status. And we're going to be looking at full moral status. And if someone has full moral status, you can't treat them the way that we currently treat animals. So this would require a radical revision to the way that we currently treat animals. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of the big theories. So I'm going to focus on utilitarianism and rights theory, and we'll go into what that means. And if you're interested in the other big ones, one of the papers covers that. And then the final big topic in animal ethics is applied animal ethics. So that deals with all the real world issues and trying to figure out which correct principles and actions apply to those issues. And so we're going to look at that now. So the first big issue in applied animal ethics is experimentation on animals. And the main question there is, should we abolish animal experimentation? There's cosmetics and then there's medical, and those are two different subtopics of that question. So for pets and companion animals, the main question there is, what legal status should they have? For wild animals, should we intervene to prevent widespread wild animal suffering? So that's the big topic there at the moment. And then animal agriculture and meat, which is what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the presentation. And the big questions there are, should animal farming be abolished? How harmful are animal products? And are we required to be vegan? So the final big topic in animal ethics is activism. So which responses to animal oppression are required or justified? Is it enough to be vegan, or do we have to do more than that? If we do have to do more than that, what should that look like? And should we use reason and evidence to help and save the most animals we can? And someone's giving a talk on that tomorrow, Courtney, on effective altruism in animals. So now we've looked at the applied issues. Let's look at moral status. So there's three basic positions on the moral status of animals. The first one is complete exclusion. So they just shouldn't be morally considered at all. Anything goes when it comes to animals. So this would require no change to our current practices, or maybe even removing existing protections. So this would be the view of animal using industries. Anything goes. And a lot of older philosophy also took this view. So the second view is partial inclusion. So they should have some consideration, and this would require a small change to current practices. So this is the view of conservative institutions, such as the RSPCA and veterinarians, and probably most of the public at the moment. And some philosophers today would defend this as well. And then the third view, which we're going to be focusing on next, is complete inclusion, so full moral status, and this would require a radical change to our current practices. So this is the view of most activists, and maybe most philosophers today. It depends on their area of specialization. So if they haven't looked much at the issue, then maybe they would be more in the middle. But most people who have looked at the issue, most philosophers, do think that they have full moral status and we need to radically change how we treat animals. So before I go into the rest of the presentation, I want to talk about moral psychology. So the big question here is there a trade-off between the moral status of animals and the moral status of humans? So some theorists have argued that you cannot raise animals without lowering humans. And if you lower humans, it's necessarily disadvantaged humans who will have it the worst off in that scenario. But we can actually test this. So a 2016 study found robust evidence that love of social hierarchies and inequality is a key factor linking racism and speciesist attitudes. So they chose to pick the example of racism to explore that. And then another study, 2019, found a strong connection between recognition of human rights and animal rights, both at the individual attitude level and at the US state policy level. And their results demonstrate that support for animal rights strongly links to support for disadvantaged or marginalized human populations, including LGBT groups, racial minorities, undocumented immigrants, and the poor. So is there a trade-off? No. Humans and animals rise or fall together when it comes to moral status and consideration. So now we're going to look at Peter Singer, who kind of got there first in terms of introducing a systematic and radical new approach to how we should treat animals. So he has a utilitarian perspective, which basically just means that we should maximize well-being. So the community that has moral status, we should maximize their overall well-being. He popularized the concept of speciesism, which is when you give unequal consideration based on species. And he argued that that's an indefensible prejudice, which is analogous to racism and sexism, in the way that you would give unequal consideration based on race or based on sex. He's arguing that it's wrong to do that based on species. And that principles of equality must reject speciesism like they reject racism and sexism. He also argued for sentientism. So sentience is when you have a subjective experience. There's something it's like to be you, so your life could go better or worse, and what happens to you matters to you. And he argued it's always sufficient for having moral status. And morally relevant interests, at least, no matter how rich or simple your mental life is, if you're sentient at all, you have a morally relevant interest in not suffering. He also used the argument from marginal cases, which we're going to look at next. And he defended moral veganism as a boycott. So the industry is miserable, it mistreats animals, and veganism is a kind of boycott. Now the asterisk there is because this was written, animal liberation was written almost 50 years ago. Pretty much no one knew the word vegan then, so they said vegetarian, and the asterisk just means vegetarian and vegan. And they also talked about how harmful eggs and dairy are, but they just used the term vegetarian. And his work led to the creation of activist organizations all around the world, especially Australia. So the argument from marginal cases. This is the single biggest argument for the full moral status of animals, and it relies on a key fact. And that fact is that for any feature of humans that's used to justify human supremacy, it will either exclude some humans or include some animals. So let's look at an example. So if we use intelligence, if it's right to think about intelligence in terms of levels, so you can have more or less intelligence, well, pigs have more intelligence than human infants. They have the same intelligence, roughly, as a human toddler. So if the level is enough to exclude pigs, it's also going to exclude infants. Or if the level is low enough to include infants, it's also going to include pigs. And there are other features where the same issue applies. Self-awareness, language, moral agency, or close human relationships. There's no way to include all humans while excluding all animals. So Singer's version of this is actually conditional. If you believe that we should not make marginal humans suffer, which refers to infants and people with profound cognitive disabilities, then you should be consistent by accepting that we should not make animals suffer. And Reagan's version, and we're going to look at his other ideas next, is unconditional. So he says it's clearly wrong to harm these marginal humans. So due to consistency, it's clearly wrong to harm animals. So there's a couple issues we could take with this argument. The first is the name. Being called marginal. So marginal means at the edge. and that could be demeaning to people with disabilities. It's not a good way of thinking about disability. And being called marginal is also very misleading. Every single one of us has been an infant, so how could it be right to think about that as being an edge case? You could also just directly question the argument and say, how important are consistency or features for ethics? So some people have argued that ethics is very relational and particular and contextual, and features and consistency just don't have this kind of law. So now we're going to look at, that was the biggest one, the argument from marginal cases. Now we're going to look at some other ones, which I think are also really good. So direct consideration, which says that you can directly see that their suffering and deaths are bad, perhaps through empathy. So we don't need to rely on thinking about humans to see that the way we treat animals is just bad, that their suffering is just bad. In fact, one author, Carol J. Adams, argued it might be speciesist that we make comparison to humans. Why isn't their suffering enough on its own? And then argument from vulnerabilities. So I've got two quotes. Animals cannot give or withhold their consent, cannot represent or vocalize their own interests, cannot understand or rationalize their suffering. They are morally innocent or blameless. They are vulnerable and relatively defenseless. All these considerations make the infliction of harm on animals not easier, but harder to justify. And here's the second one. Rights are not a prize awarded to whichever individual or species scores highest on some scale of cognitive capacities. The key purpose of justice is the protection of vulnerable individuals. So I think all three of these arguments work, and that animals, we can demonstrate through these that animals have full moral status. So now we're going to look at Reagan and the case for animal rights. And this is my favorite quote in all of philosophy. What happens to them matters to them. And I cried when I first read it, and sometimes I cry when I read it again. The case for animal rights, his book, is really overkill. It's like 500 pages. It's quite dense. So I've printed, he's got an essay-length version, and I printed 10 copies of that I highly recommend. So the best way to understand Reagan is his differences with Singer. So he rejects Peter Singer's utilitarian approach, and he argues that utilitarianism only cares about our experiences rather than us. So in that way of thinking, we are not valuable, we only contain valuable happiness. And he also argued that when you try to maximize overall well-being, you lose sight of the value of individual lives. He argued that animals have complex mental lives. So like us, they are subjects of a life, which is his term. And because they are subjects of a life, they have inherent value that's equal to all others. Anyone with inherent value has the right to be treated with respect, not as a mere resource to benefit others. So that's the heart of his theory. He also introduced this distinction between moral agents, who are people who have ethical responsibilities because we can reflect on our actions, so that would include us. And then there are moral patients, so those with moral status but no responsibilities. So that would include infants and people with profound cognitive disabilities. And so if you think about patient as in like a hospital, so the doctor is responsible for the well-being of the patients, but the patients don't have responsibilities. They're just there to receive care. He argued that rights imply obligations for other moral agents like us. And he argued that from the basic principle of respect, we can generate other principles. So the three big ones are harm. We cannot harm animals. This is called beneficence, which just means try to make their lives go better. And the right to life. So we cannot kill animals except in cases where it would be good for them. And that's euthanasia. So if your life is filled with such extreme misery that cannot be fixed, then your life is no longer good for you. And in that case, it would be good to euthanize them. But that term is so abused in the industry that it's important not to get those two mixed up. And from this principle of respect, we should be vegans because animal farming is inherently wrong. And from the rights and principles above, we must completely abolish all animal agriculture, experimentation, hunting, sport, and other uses of animals. So Singer is against our treatment of animals in practice. Reagan is against it in principle and practice. And finally, his position on wild animals was just leave them alone. And yeah, I've printed out his essay, The Case for Animal Rights, which condenses his arguments and his views. So now we're going to look at how harmful are animal products. There are different ways of going about this, and I like numbers, and numbers help me think about it. And so I'm going to explore some interesting numbers about this. So the first point is that animal products are necessarily linked to harm. Chris Delforce spoke before, and his documentary Dominion is fantastic. There's also the Humane Society of the United States has extremely comprehensive welfare reports on different industries, on pretty much all of them. And so those are pretty conclusive. So there are two big harms in how we treat animals. There are a lot of other ones, but we're going to focus on the big two, which is suffering and killing. So you can think about suffering in terms of duration and intensity. Unfortunately, we haven't developed a good way of estimating intensity yet. And there's one way of doing duration that works for some industries but not for others, and we're going to take a look at that. And then killing. The main way to think about the harm of killing is through deprivation, and we're going to look at that as well. So we're going to look at harm from three angles. We're going to look at it at the industry level, at the level of servings, and individual, yearly, and lifetime consumption. So duration of suffering. The key fact is that about 95% of meat and other animal products come from factory farms, which are basically hell on earth. So animal products at the moment are virtually interchangeable with factory farming. One approach to this, if you're trying to estimate suffering, is to take the view that their entire existence is suffering. So if it's true that they have constant negative experience, then the duration of their suffering is just how long they've been alive for. So if you know how old they are when they've been slaughtered, you know how long they've been suffering for. There are other approaches, but they're still in their early stages, unfortunately, where you kind of work the other way around. And so we're going to focus on this form of injury and this form of injury and this disease, and we're trying to add up how long does this affect them for, and instead of saying this really broad thing where their whole lifespan is suffering, trying to add it up. And you can actually get to the majority of their life is suffering through that approach, working the other way. So killing and deprivation. You might have seen this infographic before. I'm not sure if it's too clear at the back, but so the bar is their whole potential lifespan, and the length of the bar is how long they would have been able to live if they hadn't been slaughtered at a really young age. And then the green bar is what proportion of their potential life we slaughtered them at. So pigs are slaughtered at 6 months, and they could have lived for 12 years. And so this is very useful for thinking about the deprivation account of death, which is the idea that death is bad because your future would have been valuable to you, and that's been stolen. Just like your current welfare is valuable to you, your future welfare is also valuable to you. So the issue that we need to think about is which valuable future is being stolen. So if they live in factory farms, and that's constant misery, which future is being stolen? And I think that the valuable future that's being stolen is that they could have been rescued and taken to a farmed animal sanctuary where they could live their life in peace and happiness. And the other thing to note about this infographic is that almost all farmed animals are killed at around 5 to 10% of their potential lifespan, which means that they're deprived of about 90 to 95% of their life. So now we're going to look at the industry level. So again, I'm not sure if it's too easy to see, but we've got the industry, so chickens, hens, pigs, farm fishes, and then I've got a few others. I've got the deaths per year, and then I've got the lifespan on average per animal. And from those two alone, if you take the entire existence view, you can calculate how many years, million years of suffering we are generating per year per industry. So for chickens, 650 million, almost 2 months each, that comes to 95 million years. This is per year, and this is just for Australia. And I put the 4 extreme ones at the top. So the entire existence view is more accurate and more helpful in some of these industries than others. So chickens, hens, pigs, and farm fishes, pretty much constant misery. Whereas beef cows, dairy cows, and wild animals and sheep, it's not exactly constant misery. There's a lot of mistreatment, but it's not constant misery. And from this, we can calculate the total suffering, and it comes to, across just these industries I've chosen to look at, 565 million years of suffering per year. And we can break it down by percentage. So about 17% of that comes from chickens. About 2/3 of that is from farm fishes. So a lot of people think that if you're eating beef, then that's worse than eating chicken or fish, and that eating chicken or fish is somehow better for animals. It's actually the exact opposite. So chicken and fish are by far the worst, and hens are up there as well. And so we're going to look at the key findings from this. So the suffering of chickens and fishes make up the overwhelming majority of farmed animal suffering in duration and intensity. So 80% just from chickens and fishes, followed by egg-laying hens. The total amount of suffering Australia inflicts on farmed animals each year adds up to 565 million years. But the problem with that, and why I don't love this approach, is our brains aren't equipped to process that number. We can't put that into context. So we're going to look at another perspective in a second. And so this industry level doesn't concern you so much as a consumer. The next perspectives do. This concerns you as a citizen. So this is going on in your country, and we should probably do something about that. So let's look at the servings level. So a serving I put as 250 grams, about the size of a fist. So how much harm is in that much of each animal product? And this depends crucially on how big they are when they're dying. So chickens and fishes are very small, whereas a cow used for beef is very big. And so when you're eating one serving, you're taking up a vastly bigger proportion of the chicken or fish than you are of the cow. And the other factor is how long their life is. And so when you eat one serving of a farmed fish, that is about 5.5% of their life. And because they live 3 years, that is 2 months of their life in one serving. And farm fishes, as I said before, are one of the most extreme violators of animal welfare. This is their marketing. So this is what they are trying to sell. And it's an underwater factory farm, and these fish would usually be swimming like hundreds of kilometers, and they're all covered in their own waste, and they get diseases, and it's just terrible. And so one serving of chicken is about 4.5 days. One serving of egg is almost a week, 6.4 days of their life. And so the chickens, egg-laying hens are also one of the extreme violators of animal welfare, where their life pretty much is constant misery. One serving of pig meat is about half a day. One serving of sheep, because on average they're killed when they're lambs, so that's about a week of their life. One serving of beef is about half a day, and one serving of dairy is about half an hour. And again, the reason why dairy is smaller is because they produce so much more milk than a chicken can produce of meat. So they produce 8,400 litres per year, so you're having a much tinier proportion of their life. So that's the servings level. And also, I'm worried about the pronunciation, but Ryoji Shua, he's doing a talk next on the experiences of fish and the pain that they suffer. So the key findings from the servings level: each serving or meal of animal products, with the exception of dairy, surprisingly inflicts many hours or days of suffering. The very worst impact per serving is fishes, followed by eggs and chickens. The amount of suffering from each animal product depends heavily on weight and lifespan. So, how bad is an omelette? People think that vegetarianism is pretty much good enough, but how bad is an omelette? So, I love this question. Using the Good Foods recipe on BBC, an omelette uses 3 eggs, and each egg is about 70 grams. So 3 eggs is 1% of the 300 eggs that a hen will lay in her life. A hen's life is about 16 months of misery. 1% of that is 4.8 days. So one omelette is around 5 days of misery for a hen. That's per meal. A single egg, and the reason for that is that a single egg represents more than a day of suffering for a hen. So their lives are pretty much constant misery, and they only lay about 300 eggs a year. So each egg is more than a day of their life. Now we're going to look at average yearly consumption. So this is the average Australian diet per year, per individual. So you eat about more than 1,000 meals a year, and I'm using the consumption levels from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and this is for 2021. So about 6 kilos of sheep, 15 kilos of fishes. That's about half of the fishes we eat are farmed, and about half of them are wild. So I've just averaged them into fishes in that way. About 18 kilos of beef, 20 kilos of pork, 45 kilos of chicken. So this is the biggest in terms of a meat product. 10 kilos of eggs, 95 litres of dairy. And so we can actually add up the deaths per year. So 25 deaths per year. And the thing that a lot of people neglect to do, and it seemed obvious for me to do, was you can calculate how much suffering there is per year. So it's about 800 days for chickens. It's, 5 years for fishes. And so that adds up to 8.5 years of suffering per year, per individual. And 25 deaths per year. And you can also break it down in terms of percentage. So a quarter of the suffering is coming from chickens. About 60% is coming from fishes. And then about 8% is coming from hens. So the big takeaways from this are that the overwhelming majority of suffering inflicted by the average Australian diet is due to chickens and fishes, followed by eggs. And just those three products alone add up to 92% of the suffering of the industries that we've looked at. And so I think one takeaway from this is that if you're encouraging someone to transition towards veganism, diet transitions, you should encourage them to start with these products. And also each year an individual following the average Australian diet kills 25 animals, inflicts 8.5 years of suffering. And the reason why you can inflict more than one suffering of year per year is because it's spread out over many more animals than you. So it's spread out over those 25 animals. Now we're going to look at lifetime consumption. So the meals you eat in your lifetime, we're going to assume a lifetime of 75 years. That adds up to 82,000 meals. And so here are the figures for what that adds up to. If we extrapolate from current levels of consumption and we do that for 75 years, what does that add up to? Oops, sorry. And so what we find is one lifetime of average Australian consumption, it would involve 1,100 deaths from chickens, 37 hens, 17 pigs, about 700 fishes, 5 beef cows, 1 dairy cow, and 22 sheep. And the suffering, so if you add up the total deaths, it's 1,900. And if you add up the suffering, it's 640 years. This is for one person's diet. And if you look at the percentage of the total, it's the same as the last one, a quarter for chickens, about 60% for fishes, 8% for hens. So the key findings, if you extrapolate from current consumption levels, the average Australian will kill 1,900 animals and inflict 640 years of animal suffering through their diet. Almost all of this harm, 92%, is due to consumption of fishes, chickens, and eggs. So is this the worst thing that we're doing? 640 years of suffering and 1,900 deaths. Yes, I think it pretty clearly is the worst thing that we're doing by far. I can't imagine what would even come close to this. So we're one final step from veganism. So we've established the full moral status of animals, and we've established the extreme harm of animal products for farmed animals. Are we finished? Is that enough for veganism? A lot of vegan outreaches would kind of finish there, but I think there's one step which is kind of our weak point. So this is called the production-consumption gap, which asks, when production is profoundly wrong, does this make voluntary consumption wrong, and why? So there are different answers you could give to this. So the first one, consumption, really purchases, increases production, which is wrong. And this one is complicated because it gets into economics. And so I would just encourage reading this paper, Against Inefficacy Objections by McMullen, 2018. I tried putting it into a couple slides and simplifying it. It just doesn't work. It's too dense, unfortunately. So if someone challenges you on that, there's further reading. It would be good if advocates had a better understanding of how that works. But that's the first connection you can make. The second one is that consumption expresses an immoral attitude towards animals and their oppression, and that makes it wrong. The third one is that consumption treats animals as edible, and it's wrong to see them that way. The fourth one is that consumption is a form of participation in the atrocity, which is wrong. And then the last one is that consumption makes it harder for you to end the production. So how can you be fighting as well as you can to end an atrocity if you're choosing to benefit from it in a way that you don't really need to? And there's interesting experiments showing that if you take a random group, split them in two, get one of them to snack on nuts, one of them to snack on jerky or something, and you ask them about the mental life of animals and our treatment of animals, the ones given jerky will say like, oh, animals can't feel much and it doesn't really matter how we treat them and that kind of stuff. So it's difficult to fight for people you're eating. And if you're interested in more of this step, I've got a paper, The Ethical Basis for Veganism. So the conclusion, before I talk about some more recommendations, it is unjustified to deny full moral status to animals. We must abolish institutional use and fix our basic political and legal institutions to provide justice for animals. Animal products are extremely harmful to farmed animals, and we must be vegan. So, here's some books I recommend, in case you want to know more about animal ethics and veganism. So the first one, I think the best book on ethical veganism is Dialogues on Ethical Vegetarianism by Michael Humer. It's a fictional argument between two philosophy students, a vegan and a carnist, and it goes over 4 days and they cover different aspects of pretty much tackling it from every issue. I've turned it into a free 2-hour audiobook that's on YouTube and SoundCloud, so it's very short. Each chapter is 30 minutes and there's only 4 chapters. It's really good. And for an overview of animal ethics, I think the best ones are Ethics in Animals, but an introduction by Laurie Gruen, which is the one on the left with the chimpanzee, and Animal Ethics Contemporary Introduction by Bob Fisher. So both of these are around 300 pages, whereas the last one was tiny. And then finally, Animal Liberation Now by Peter Singer. It's just being fully updated and revised a couple months ago. And he's actually going to be in Perth soon. I'm not sure exactly when, but he's going to be talking about this kind of stuff. And then, so this is the very last slide. I've got my readings that go into more detail about the stuff I've been covering. If you want a copy. That's it. Thank you.